30,000 years ago, someone in what is now southern Germany sat down with a piece of mammoth ivory and spent considerable time carving it into a shape that needs no explanation. 20 centimeters long, carefully polished, scored with deliberate markings along its surface, the object found by archaeologist Nicholas Conard and his team from the University of Tübingen at Hohle Fels cave in 2008 is the oldest confirmed sexual artifact on Earth. It was discovered alongside carved bird figures, a lion-human composite, and the oldest known flutes made from vulture bone and swan bone. The people who made these things were, by any cognitive measurement, fully modern humans. They made music, tracked seasons, and apparently made objects whose only documented purpose was the deliberate experience of pleasure. That discovery asks a question that science spent a century trying to answer, without embarrassing anyone. When did humans start having sex for reasons that had nothing to do with reproduction? The answer reaches back farther than most people are prepared to accept, and it dismantles something we assumed was a product of civilization and comfort and leisure time accumulated late in the human story. The evidence is older than that. Pleasure was not something the human body discovered. It was built into the architecture of the body itself, hundreds of thousands of years before the first city, the first legal code, the first moral framework that tried to tell people what their bodies were for. If this story is touching your heart, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if a woman in your family came west with nothing and built a home, share her name in the comments. I read every one. Most people carry an understanding of ancient human sexuality that looks something like this: survival-driven, opportunistic, and about as romantic as a chapter on cell division. The assumption runs deep: find a mate, reproduce, continue the species. Sex as mechanism, sex as function, sex as something ancient humans experienced because the body demanded it for the continuation of the lineage, and the pleasure was simply the mechanism evolution used to ensure the behavior kept happening at all. This logic feels airtight. Natural selection rewards outcomes. It does not select for pleasure as an end in itself, only for the behaviors that lead to successful reproduction. So the standard account says, ancient humans had sex because reproduction required it, and pleasure was the incentive, not the goal. The problem is that several lines of evidence, from anatomy, from primatology, from the archaeological record, and from evolutionary biology, decline to cooperate with this account. They point in a different direction, and the direction they point is much older than anyone expected. In 1998, urologist Helen O'Connell at the Royal Melbourne Hospital published a paper that rearranged a century of anatomical assumption. Using dissection and MRI imaging, she mapped the complete internal structure of the clitoris for the first time in modern medical literature. What she found was not a small external organ, it was an extensive internal complex, several centimeters in depth, surrounding the vaginal canal, with a nerve density that exceeds any comparable structure in the human body by the widest margin recorded in the anatomical literature. The external portion most people can identify is roughly the visible surface of a structure that continues far inward, connecting to deep pelvic nerve networks. The entire anatomical investment of the structure points toward a single biological output. Every nerve ending, every deep tissue connection, every centimeter of that extended internal anatomy serves the same documented function: producing pleasure. Researchers have found no reproductive mechanism, no fertility signaling pathway, no architecture that benefits offspring survival. The structure exists, in the complete clinical sense, to produce an experience. Evolution abandons what it does not need. Every structure that costs the body metabolic energy to develop and maintain persists because it delivers some selective advantage. If this anatomy provided none, it would have been dropped over millions of years of evolutionary pressure, the way cave-dwelling fish lost eyes they no longer used. The fact that this structure persisted, elaborated, and became more anatomically developed across the primate lineage is evidence that resists the simple story. O'Connell's work was extended in 2022 by a team at the University of New South Wales, led by anatomist Helen Garay, which produced the first complete three-dimensional model of the full clitoral complex using medical imaging. The structure turned out to be more extensive than prior descriptions had captured. The body had been maintaining considerably more than anyone had formally described across millions of years of evolution for a single documented reason. Nicholas Conard's 2008 discovery at Hohle Fels was not isolated. Researchers have cataloged carved objects across Paleolithic sites in Germany, France, and the Czech Republic that serve no functional survival purpose beyond sexual representation. The Gorge d'Enfer in the Dordogne region of France contains limestone carvings that archaeologist Denis Vialou at the National Museum of Natural History in Paris described in a 1986 survey of Paleolithic art as explicitly sexual in content. These images date to roughly 25,000 years ago. The Venus figurines, small carved female forms found across Eurasian sites from Spain to Siberia, were initially catalogued as fertility objects. Researchers, including April Noel at the University of Victoria, have challenged that interpretation over the past 3 decades, noting that the figurines vary too widely in form and anatomical emphasis to serve a single symbolic function tied to childbearing capacity. Some of the figures represent anatomy with a deliberate attention that suggests cultural engagement and aesthetic interest rather than purely symbolic reference to reproduction. These objects were made by people capable of symbolic thought. They chose to represent sexuality. That choice tells you that sexuality was already a category of human experience with enough cultural weight to warrant permanent material representation. Then there is the biological comparative evidence, and this is where the picture becomes something the standard account cannot absorb without breaking. Primatologist Frans de Waal spent decades at Emory University's Yerkes National Primate Research Center documenting the social behavior of bonobos, the closest living primate relative of modern humans alongside chimpanzees. What he found was a species that uses sexual contact as a primary social tool. Bonobos have sex to resolve conflict between individuals, to greet each other after separation, to negotiate access to food, to reduce tension within a group. Female bonobos have sex with other females, males with males. Bonobos of various age and gender combinations engage in sexual contact that has no reproductive possibility and no plausible reproductive function. De Waal published these observations across multiple papers through the 1980s and 1990s, and the initial scientific response treated bonobos as an anomaly. Then researchers looked more carefully at dolphins, who engage in non-reproductive sexual contact at rates that resisted easy categorization. Then at certain bird species, the pattern kept reappearing across unrelated lineages, sexual behavior serving social purposes, relationship purposes, and what researchers began carefully describing as experiential purposes, in species with the neural complexity to register something we would recognize as wanting. What this means for the human lineage is not subtle. If the primate ancestor we share with bonobos was already using sex as a social instrument before the human and chimpanzee lineages split, then non-reproductive sexuality did not develop in humans. It was inherited. The starting point is older than the species. Medical historian John Riddle at North Carolina State University published research in 1994 examining plant-based contraceptive knowledge across ancient cultures. His study documented evidence of contraceptive plant use in ancient Greece, Egypt, and Rome, with evidence pointing to earlier periods in some traditions. The plants he identified, including Queen Anne's lace, pennyroyal, and silphium, the last of which was so commercially valued in ancient Carthage and Rome that it was likely harvested into extinction, contain compounds that interfere with fertility at the level of implantation or sperm function. Modern pharmacological analysis confirms that some of these preparations would have had genuine contraceptive effect. The implication is direct. Ancient people were actively working to have sex without producing children. They had identified the relationship between sex and reproduction and were managing the outcomes they did not want. They wanted the experience. They managed the consequence. That required first recognizing that the experience and its biological outcome could be separated, and then caring enough about the experience to make that separation a practical priority. The story of ancient sexuality contains a complication that the biology alone cannot explain. Ancient bodies wanted what they wanted. The more revealing question is what recorded civilization decided to do with that fact. Historian Kyle Harper at the University of Oklahoma spent years tracing the history of sexual regulation in ancient Rome and early Christian communities. His research documents a shift that happened roughly 2,000 years ago, not in human biology and not in human desire, but in the legal and moral frameworks built around both. Roman sexual culture was stratified by class, gender, and social status, but within it existed a relatively matter-of-fact acknowledgement that sex was pleasurable and that pleasure had social value. The shift Harper traces is the emergence of a framework that located the legitimate purpose of sex specifically in reproduction, and treated pleasure as a motive to be managed, confessed, and minimized. That framework did not emerge from biology. The body itself had not changed. The clitoris in the 2nd century of the Common Era was anatomically identical to the clitoris in 28,000 BCE. What changed was the interpretation built on top of a biology that had been there the whole time. Anthropologist Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy at the University of California, Davis, published research across multiple decades examining what she described as concealed ovulation in human females. Unlike most primates, human females show no visible external sign of fertility. No swelling, no color change, no behavioral signal that announces the moment when conception is possible. Hrdy's interpretation was that this concealment, which appears to be an evolved characteristic, would have functionally decoupled sex from reproduction in early human social groups. If the fertile period cannot be reliably identified by anyone, sex cannot be organized neatly around it. Partners cannot optimize for conception. Groups cannot restrict sexual behavior to reproductively efficient moments. The concealment is, in Hrdy's reading, an evolutionary argument that sex in the human lineage was already happening for reasons that extended beyond the making of offspring. The body was structured to make the two motivations difficult to separate cleanly, and one reading of that structure is that separating them was never the design intent. Kim Wallen at Emory University and philosopher of biology Elizabeth Lloyd at Indiana University published research examining what they described as the evolutionary status of female orgasm. The female orgasm has no confirmed reproductive necessity. Unlike male orgasm, which is mechanically required for sperm delivery, the female version produces no equivalent reproductive outcome. It is consistent across the human female population. It involves the same neural reward pathways, the same dopamine release, the same oxytocin response as any experience the brain categorizes as worth repeating, and it serves, as far as reproductive biology can determine, no reproductive function. Lloyd's argument, developed more fully in her 2005 book on the subject, was that this is a sign that the design sequence ran differently from what the textbooks assumed. The neural capacity for pleasure developed alongside reproduction, rather than in service of it. Reproduction arrived into a body already organized around seeking certain experiences for their own sake. The question of when ancient humans started having sex for pleasure assumes a starting point that the evidence consistently declines to identify. The anatomy does not have one the evidence can locate. The primate behavior does not have one. The archaeological objects suggest that by 30,000 years ago, pleasure was already being given cultural form, which means the experience was old enough to be worth representing in permanent material. The before that the question imagines almost certainly does not exist in the way the question assumes it does. If you're still with us on this porch, do this story a kindness. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell. These quiet stories don't get told if you don't share them. Tag someone who loves a true frontier story in the comments. Let them know we're telling these the way they deserve to be told. In 2015, a team of neuroscientists at Rutgers University, led by Barry Komisaruk, published brain imaging studies of the human sexual response using functional MRI. What the data showed was not a localized neural event. Orgasm involves coordinated activation across more than 30 distinct brain regions simultaneously, including the limbic system, the prefrontal cortex, the cerebellum, the hippocampus, and the nucleus accumbens, the region most closely associated with reward processing and the motivation to seek experiences again. No other voluntary physical event produces consistent activation across that range. The brain does not respond to sex the way it responds to eating or sleeping. The response is categorically wider, involving structures associated with memory, anticipation, bonding, and emotional processing at the same time. That level of neural investment is not what you would expect from a system whose only purpose was facilitating reproduction. Bacteria reproduce without any of this machinery. The metabolic cost of coordinating 30 engaged brain regions, a cascade of oxytocin and dopamine and endorphins, and the full mammalian bonding chemistry is considerable. Evolution does not maintain expensive systems without returns. The most coherent answer to what the return was, the experience itself was the return. The body was built to want it, to remember it, and to seek it again. That is the design signature of a system organized around pleasure as a primary output. Biological anthropologist Helen Fisher at Rutgers University has spent 4 decades studying the neuroscience of human attachment. Her research, which includes brain imaging studies of people in early romantic relationships and in long-term pair bonds, identified 3 distinct neurochemical systems in the human brain that operate around sexuality and social bonding, but are not the same system. The first involves testosterone and estrogen and operates as what Fisher calls the lust system, a general drive towards sexual gratification. The second involves dopamine and norepinephrine and drives what she describes as attraction, the focused motivation toward a specific individual. The third involves oxytocin and vasopressin and produces attachment, the calmer, sustained bond between people who have shared extended intimacy. These 3 systems can operate independently of each other. Deep attachment can coexist with minimal active lust. Intense lust can exist without attachment. Strong attraction can arise with no reproductive intent whatsoever. Fisher's work was originally designed to explain romantic love. Its implications for understanding early human social life reach much further back. If these 3 systems are ancient, if they predate modern humans in the primate lineage, then the emotional complexity we associate with human sexuality was not invented by civilization. It was inherited from something that had been producing bonding, desire, and social complication millions of years before the first law tried to organize any of it. Return to the cave at Hohle Fels for a moment. The ivory object Nicholas Conard's team found was discovered alongside carved birds, animal figures, and the oldest known musical instruments. None of these items serve direct survival functions. You cannot hunt with a carved bird. You cannot build shelter with a flute. These are objects made by people who had enough cognitive space and enough symbolic capacity to produce things whose purpose was experiential and representational rather than practical. The presence of a sexual object in that assemblage makes a specific claim about how those people related to sexuality. It was already a category of human experience that warranted cultural expression. It was being thought about deliberately enough to be given permanent physical form. That requires a relationship with the experience that is reflective rather than purely instinctual, people aware of what they were experiencing and motivated to mark it as worth preserving. Researcher Genevieve von Petzinger at the University of Victoria has spent years cataloging the geometric signs that appear consistently across Paleolithic cave sites from Europe to Africa. Her analysis, published across multiple papers between 2010 and 2016, identified 32 recurring symbols found at sites separated by thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years. The consistency points to a shared symbolic vocabulary, a set of concepts that traveled across human populations over enormous distances and time spans. Among the symbols are several that researchers have associated with bodily or sexual themes in their interpretations. The specific meaning of any individual mark remains a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. What is not in question is that the human mind was already engaged, by this period, in the project of encoding experience into symbols and sharing that encoding across communities and generations. Sexuality was somewhere in that project. Its presence in the symbolic record of early humans is not incidental. Here is what the accumulated evidence converges toward, and it is not what the original question suggested it would find. The question assumed a before. It imagined ancient humans operating in a mode of purely reproductive sexuality, and then, at some identifiable moment, crossing into something more. The anatomy does not support this picture. The primate behavior does not. The neuroimaging does not. The archaeological record does not. What the evidence shows is a species that inherited, from the primate lineage, a body organized around pleasure as a genuine biological output, a brain with 3 semi-independent systems for lust, attraction, and attachment that can operate separately from reproductive intent, and a behavioral repertoire that had been using sex for social purposes long before the species itself existed. Alfred Kinsey published his studies on human sexual behavior in 1948 and 1953. The cultural reaction to those studies is more informative than the findings. What Kinsey documented, through interviews with tens of thousands of Americans, was a gap between public accounts of sexual behavior and actual sexual behavior so wide that it implied most of what civilization had been publicly insisting about human sexuality for roughly 2,000 years was a working fiction. The desires were not new. They had been operating under the surface of a moral architecture that insisted they did not or should not exist. The desires were ancient. The architecture was the recent addition. The architecture of denial that Kinsey's data exposed was not arbitrary. It was functional. A community whose members can be made to feel shame around a natural drive is a community whose behavior can be more precisely managed. Sexual regulation and social control have traveled together across most of recorded history for the same reason that food regulation and debt regulation have. Controlling access to something people want is a mechanism of power, and the mechanism works best when the wanting itself is made to feel suspect. Medical historian Thomas Lacour at the University of California, Berkeley, documented how scientific and medical descriptions of human sexuality shifted over time in ways that tracked cultural pressures rather than new biological knowledge. His research showed that interpretations of sexual anatomy changed repeatedly across centuries, not because the anatomy changed, but because the interpretive framework changed. What a society needs sex to mean shapes how it describes the biology it is examining. Helen O'Connell's 1998 paper was not revealing a new structure. The structure had always been there. The delay was not a matter of scientific tools. It was a matter of what the examining culture was prepared to acknowledge. No other species has to be taught to want sex. The wanting appears without instruction. What requires teaching, what requires sustained social machinery to establish and maintain, is the suppression of it. Control is the learned behavior. The desire is what the body arrived with. The carved object from Hohle Fels cave does not mark the beginning of human pleasure. It marks a moment in a history that was already long by the time someone picked up that piece of ivory. The actual origin is in the primate lineage, in the development of the neural reward systems that made any experience capable of being sought for its own sake, in the elaboration of the limbic structures across millions of years of mammalian evolution. By the time someone in southern Germany was spending hours on that carving, the experience being referenced was already old enough to be a simple fact of life, old enough to be given permanent form without ceremony or explanation, old enough to be just another thing that was true about being alive in a body. The relationship between the human body and pleasure is not a story of discovery or progress or the gradual accumulation of freedom. The capacity was always present. The experience was always present. What has shifted across recorded history is only the narrative constructed around both. What pleasure was legitimately for, who was permitted to seek it, and what seeking it was taken to reveal about a person's character or worth. Those are questions each culture answers for itself. The body has been answering the same question in the same direction for a very long time, and it has never once needed permission. Thank you for staying until the last word. If this story moved you, the next one is already up on your screen. Go give it a watch. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and join the porch. We're telling stories about women who carried more than the world ever knew. See you in the next one.